Hey, I'm Sarah, and this is my project. I'm going to be talking about how chronic stress and cortisol basically just reshape the brain system that we rely on for learning, and then kind of zoom out to how our modern environment might also be changing measured intelligence, and also just what that means for me as a student, and then later on in my life whenever I become a physician. So here's some context about me and why I chose this topic. I'm a full-time college student, and I also work a lot. Like, I have two jobs, like 50-ish hours a week on top of that. And then also, I'm just preparing for the MCAT currently. So, stress is built into my everyday life. Recently, I've noticed that learning kind of has felt harder than it used to, even when I'm actually trying. That made me want to understand what chronic stress might actually be doing to my brain and how it might be affecting other students in similar situations to me too. Since I'm also going to medicine, I know that I'll eventually be treating people who live under the same type of constant pressure too, if not way more. So I just kind of felt that it was important to dig into it now. So I guess to preface, stress isn't always bad. In short bursts, it actually helps you focus and react quickly when something unexpected happens. But the stress that I'm trying to talk about here is going to be this chronic stress right here. And it's that long term kind. And it's the type that doesn't really turn off. That's when your brain just keeps activating the same stress system over and over, and your body continues releasing cortisol even when nothing urgent is happening anymore. Um, when work, school, money, and family pressures all stack up, the brain can end up living in that state way more often than it's built to. And that's when it starts affecting how well you think and learn. Stress doesn't affect every part of the brain the same way. It mainly targets a few areas that we depend on for learning, memory, and decision making. The first one is going to be the hippocampus. That's the part of the brain that helps you form new memories and understand any context, really. It's also the one the most sensitive to cortisol, so it takes a hit pretty quickly as soon as stress becomes chronic. Next is going to be the prefrontal cortex, which is basically your control center for focus, planning, and working memory. This is the part you really rely on when you're trying to study or solve complex problems, and stress makes it a lot harder for it to do its job. Then lastly, we got the amygdala over here, which handles emotional reactions and threat detection. Under stress, it tends to become more reactive, which can just make everything feel way more intense or overwhelming than it needs to be. These three areas are really the core of how we think and learn, and they're also the most impacted when stress sticks around. When cortisol stays high for long periods of time, these brain areas start to change in ways that make learning a lot harder. In the hippocampus, chronic stress can lower the amount of new neurons being created and shrink the connections between existing ones. That leads to weaker memory formation and makes it harder for information to just stick in general. In the prefrontal cortex, stress can cause the connections between neurons to pull back. And that shows up as trouble focusing, holding information in your mind, or just switching between tasks. And then, meanwhile, the amygdala can actually become more active and more sensitive, which means you may feel more anxious or on edge, even when nothing major is happening or anything that should be triggering any kind of anxiety at all is occurring. All of this basically just shifts your brain out of its learning mode and turns into a survival mode, which is not great if you're just trying to do something that's inherently relaxing in a way, like studying or just trying to think clearly. All of this all together adds up to something called allostatic load, which basically means that the overall wear and tear on your body and brain from being stressed too long. Your stress system is meant to turn on when you read it and then shut it off again, but when it's being activated constantly, from work, school, family, just life, it never gets a real break. And over time, that shows up in things like disrupted sleep, higher inflammation, trouble focusing, and just feeling mentally drained, even when you've basically done nothing. For me, this hits home because my schedule is literally nonstop. I might feel like I'm functioning, but my brain is definitely carrying a heavier load than I realize. And that load directly affects how well I can actually learn and remember things, which then just turns into me essentially just wasting time on accident. So this slide is really about my brain and what it actually needs to learn well versus what it actually gets. And also, this is applicable to any other human brain, essentially. We're just doing it from my situation. Um, my brain learns best when things are predictable. when I'm sleeping enough, and when I'm not constantly being pulled in different directions. With stress, work, school, and whatever else is going on, though, it ends up dealing with distractions, pressure, and way too much cortisol. That's why I sometimes feel like I can't focus, or I forget things right after I study them, or I freeze during tests. And it's not that I'm not trying, or for anyone. It's just that my brain is working under stress conditions that make learning a lot harder than it should be, and then I end up paying the price. A Flynn effect is a good reminder that our environment has a huge impact on how well people think and learn. For most of the last century, the average IQ scores kept rising across a lot of countries, and the main explanation wasn't genetics, it was the environmental improvements like better nutrition, better education, and just more mentally stimulating lives. More recently, though, this is crazy, those gains have slowed down or have even dipped in some places. That doesn't mean that people got less intelligent necessarily, but it really means that the environment has definitely changed. So, this is important for my project because it shows that the brain isn't operating in this vacuum. Big shifts in stress, lifestyle, or just daily demands can actually move cognitive performance at the population level. And this is something that really caught my attention. When researchers looked at IQ scores in autistic youth across different time periods, they didn't see the same rising trend that the general population used to have. Instead, their average scores actually went down over the years. At the same time, autism diagnoses have increased, and we know many autistic individuals react more strongly to stress, sensory overload, and just changes in routine. Their stress systems just work differently than a neurotypical person, which makes them more sensitive to the environment around them. So the idea behind this is that autism doesn't cause like lower scores or anything. It's that autistic brains might be picking up on the environmental pressures earlier and more intensely than the rest of us. So in a way, they can show us how harsh or overwhelming our world has become, especially when it comes to learning and cognitive performance. And seeing these trends, and now seeing that the average IQ for a neurotypical person is going down, maybe this was an early warning sign for us to see how stress is really affecting us. The important thing here is that autistic and non-autistic people are living in the same environment. We're all dealing with chronic stress, broken sleep, constant digital distractions, and loud, fast, always on surroundings. And all these stressors hit the same brain systems, being the hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, and the networks that decide what feels urgent. Autistic people might feel these effects more intensely, but the direction is the same for everyone, essentially. So when we see patterns like declining performance or higher overwhelm, it's not about one specific group. It's a sign that the environment we're all in is putting pressure on the core learning circuits in the brain. For me as a student, it helps explain why I sometimes feel like I've hit a wall. It's not that I'm not trying, it's that my brain is actually just tired. And chronic stress makes it harder to learn, remember, and stay focused. Managing that stress isn't optional if I want to perform, essentially, at the level that I'm aiming for, which is pretty high, I guess. And looking ahead into medicine, this just changes how I think about patient care. Also, not just managing my own stress, but a lot of people live with constant stress, sleep problems, and sensory overload, which could be causing their actual physical health issues. And when someone forgets instructions or feels overwhelmed, that might just be their brain running on empty. So just as a doctor, I want to be able to pay attention to that and actually treat stress, sleep, and cognitive load as part of the care plan and not just an afterthought. What I really took away from this is, like, in everything that I've researched, is that stress is just a much bigger factor than most people realize. Chronic cortisol isn't just a feeling. It physically changes the part of the brain that we need for memory, focus, problem solving, and just like overall function. Seeing stronger effects in autistic groups is also just a major warning for us. Their brains are more sensitive to the environmental pressures, so they may be showing that impact earlier. But those same stresses are hitting all of us, and it's showing more in the autistic people, so we should take that as a sign. And that's just why it matters. If we don't take stress, sleep, or just sensory overload seriously, we could see broader declines in learning and cognitive performance over time. Protecting our brain health now is what's keeping us learning well in the long run. And we need to be able to figure out what these issues are actually in order to continue, just improving as the human race. These are the references I used for my project. They just include research on stress and its effects on the brain, as well as studies on the Flynn effect and just changes seen in the autistic populations. Together, they support the idea that our environment, especially chronic stress, has a real measurable impact on how well the brain learns and functions. And that's it for my project. Thanks for watching.